Chapter 5. Invasion. Derek, a rebellious teen, slipped from the city confines. The city walls were not easily surpassed, but Derek figured out a route through some of the smaller drain pipes that completely went unguarded. He jumped from a larger pipe onto the wide-open fields beyond the walls. Silver trails of comets fell through the sky, and Derek smiled, basking in the fresh air, when something in the distance caught his eye. His head quirked, and his eyes strained to make it out. There was a bright light on the flat of the distant horizon. It glowed a wild amethyst purple. Derek's ears perked, and his senses began to peak, hair standing on end. There was nothing beyond the four cities that could produce a light that bright. He stood in disbelief, trying to strain his eyes to see the source of that strange light, but he couldn't make it out from such a distance. Derek glanced back to the walls before dropping his bottle, turning back to the light, and began jogging. Curiosity piqued in him, and he used that energy to propel him into a full-on run. The vast open plains were easy to traverse, but it still took nearly an hour to get across the expanse and draw near enough to see what was happening. A strange sense of fear arose as he saw the light source. It glowed and shifted in odd angles, revealing what appeared to be a tear in the fabric of time and space itself. Then, from the glow of this strange rift, something stepped out. Derek ducked behind a large boulder, spying on the figure that emerged. It was unlike anything Derek had ever seen before, a bipedal creature with an odd face and large ears. He wore a patch over one eye that only partially covered a scar that ran the entire length of his face. The creature inhaled and smiled, flashing sharp canines. Then, from behind him, a troop emerged from the portal. Wild shrieks and cries rose as this band of strange creatures poured in. Hundreds of them at first, then thousands. They were smaller than the first creature Derek saw, about his height, and each adorned with various equipment and weapons. Some carried primitive spears, wearing shoulder pads and loin guards made of wood and debris. Others held chainsaws over their shoulder, equipped with Spartan-like helms and dual-wielding swinging maces. They were speaking in a strange language that Derek couldn't understand, but the name of the giant being became apparent. The thousands of creatures pouring through the portal began worshipping the larger one and repeatedly chanted his name. Vile, vile, vile. The sound of all of them together was deafening, and it rose a terror in Derek. He stumbled away from the boulder, suddenly feeling the need to retreat into the darkness. He needed to inform the gods and his brethren. These did not look like the sort of beings who wanted peace. The bulls were in danger. Derek turned and fled, leaving the horrible sight behind him, and made straight for the four cities without turning back. Whilst the bulls had never met another sentient race, Vile, king of the apes, had seen countless worlds. He stood triumphantly after another successful battle, and a familiar thrill rose in his blood as his troop of apes surrounded him. He wielded a device, holding the portal open for his forces to pass through. This world had appeared on the device seemingly out of nowhere. It was constantly scanning the cosmos for new and inhabited planets. A mere moments after their latest scavenge, the indicator light had started flashing before opening a portal on its own. It was a complicated device that Vile did not fully understand. He had scientists who had researched it and had learned it could open a single portal with the push of a button, or, on rare occasions, as it had just done to bring him here, the device would open a random portal on its own. He did not need to know how it worked, or why a random portal would open, for it never failed to bring him directly to where he needed to be. Narrowing his eyes, Vile set his sights across the plains, locking in on the lights emerging from the distant cities he could see on the horizon. They were so far away that they appeared to be nothing more than sparkling towers, like stars in the night. He had risen this band of sniveling apes into a powerful force of warriors, and for the past many decades they had been moving from world to world, invading sentient species and scavenging from the remains of the crumbled civilizations they had lain to waste. To Vile, this world was just another place to conquer, another step to even greater heights. He exhaled powerfully and leaped to the top of a nearby boulder. Vile was formidable, standing nearly twice as tall as the rest of the apes. His strength and power were one of the several things that had secured his place as their alpha. Taking a moment to view his troop in all their glory, he shrieked a moment later, calling the apes to attention and banging his fists on his armored chestplate. There was no time for rest, no time to waste. Vile cried out and ordered his troop forward, and with terrifying speed, the apes began to head for the nearest city. Back in the city of the bulls, Derek had gone directly to officials. They summoned the god bulls to the city from the mountain of creation. After an eternity to Derek, the god bulls finally entered the chamber, each of their steps sending a thunder of vibrations through the room. Derek was in awe at witnessing them in person. They were incredible, and at the same time, terrifying. Their eyes were like fiery orbs, and as they gazed down upon him, it felt like they were staring right into his soul. Waiting for Derek to speak, the ice god leaned forward and let out a booming huff. Derek shook himself out of his silence, bumbling for a moment, and then told them what he had seen. The god bulls communed with one another, their powerful voices deep and low. The gods had used their enhanced senses to know the truth for themselves, but by then, it was too late. Like a dark wave of locusts in the night, the apes stormed the northern city. The guards had only just managed to sound the alarms before being swarmed by vicious, biting and weapon-swinging apes. They were brutal and broke through the northern gate like it was nothing. The bulls had never faced another race, never even communed with any other being other than their own. They did not even know what race or being these horrible creatures were. To the bulls, the apes were monstrous aliens, and by the time the sun rose in the morning, the northern city had fallen. All those who survived had retreated into the sanctity of their brother cities. The apes decimated and stripped it of everything it had, taking it and the northern methane fields as their stronghold. The bulls had never faced conflict within their kind, but something inside their blood triggered and boiled as they saw the smoke rising from the northern city. The bulls were mighty and proud and would not stand for this. They would fight and protect their kind with all the might their horns could muster. The gods sounded the horns of calling and gathered every bull in the central arena at the base of the mountain of creation. They revealed the truth of the attack, and the mention of the alien foes sent a wild thrill of outrage throughout the population. The teens felt a sudden shift in their desires, standing taller and answering the call to protect their brothers. They would not allow a band of monkeys to interfere with their brethren. The gods began to plan their strategy. The fortresses of the 3 remaining cities were positioned with great advantage. They had high walls and had the upper ground. But as the gods deliberated, they realized that while their horns and size were mighty, they did not have enough weapons to arm every bull. The bulls would need every advantage they could get if they were to survive the coming horde. So, as night quickly turned into day, the gods acted as generals, setting up a great battalion of bulls outside the gates and placing bulls with projectile weapons atop the towers. The alien scourge approached, with their leader Vile at the forefront. He raised his arms and howled, sharp canines flashing in a jeering grin, riling them up for another run at the remaining cities. This time, it would be the West City. Most of the defending bulls had moved from the other cities to help defend against the approaching ape horde. This time around, the bulls knew the apes were coming. The gods bellowed their warning as the vast army of apes approached, but Vile did not heed a single word before screaming out and ordering the attack. The apes charged, and as they did, it was evident that they drastically outnumbered the bulls. But the bulls would not back down, answered with bellowing war cries of their own, and charged in with horns held low, battering through the apes like bowling pins. The first charge seemed to be to the bulls' advantage. However, many of the bulls were ill-equipped, and the apes were cunning and agile, while also seasoned soldiers. In addition, many of the apes carried weaponry the bulls had never seen before. The bulls and apes fought their first battle for days, with the tide shifting and turning back and forth. But on the last day, the apes found the advantage, driving the bulls back into the pen of their fortress like cattle. The bulls sealed their gates and took up positions, preparing themselves for a siege defense. For this, the apes were unprepared and withdrew after many of their numbers fell as they tried to scale the sides of the city. The walls were too steep and smooth for the apes to ascend, try as they might, and Vile called them back to regroup and strategize. The first city had fallen so quickly, but the second city was proving to be more of a challenge for Vile. While the bulls had just managed to escape, a major problem soon became evident. The apes' troops now occupied the fields of land upon which most of the bulls' methane was harvested, the very ore that fueled the city's energy production. Meth was in everything they used. It powered their electricity, their food mills, their technology. And most of their bulls were hitting zero breed, a term used amongst their kind to name when a donor bull had reached his maximum genetic capacity for breeding. Zero breed left many of their bulls in horrible fatigue, making them not only unable to work the methane fields, but unable to produce new teens. They were in a quickly rising crisis, and the apes were relentless and knew they could starve the bulls out of their precious energy. Days would go by with not a drop of action, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, the apes would start an assault on the city. The process would repeat itself with no end in sight. The siege drew on for weeks, and the bulls were near the breaking point. They needed to find a solution, or their race would fall. The god bulls withdrew into the deep chambers of the mountain of creation. These chambers resonated with the powerful energy of the crystalline methane that seemed to concentrate greatly within the mountain itself. Originally, the gods were solitary creatures, aiding when needed and rarely intermingling with their neighboring gods within the mountain. But with the press of conflict on their borders, they were forced to come together and figure out a way to defeat Vile and his horde of apes. Each of the 11 god bulls was so different and unique in their powers and ideals that it had never occurred to them to join forces. But when they did come together, something unexpected happened. Together, they were able to push one another to new heights. Together, they deliberated, meditated, and began to unlock new and powerful secrets they would never have come to on their own. They combined their minds in a great state of meditation and were empowered by the energy within the mountain. Their minds soared into the underworld, the place of knowledge beyond the mortal realm. Additional weeks went by, and the siege continued. Vile continued to occupy his permanent war camp with his troop of apes on the fields outside the cities. They lived there, planning and ordering more and more attacks upon the bulls, some of the soldiers finding their way past the wall and unleashing their ape fury on the bulls within. Being defeated by the apes was no longer a nightmare in the minds of every bull. It was a reality, and only a matter of time now. It was on the 5th week when suddenly the gods returned from their journey into the underworld. Their eyes glowed with bright flames of knowledge. They had news. What they were about to tell the bulls would change everything.